Okay, we're going to look at plant and animal cells, quite obviously, right? And the term I want to immediately familiarize you guys with is the idea of a eukaryote or a eukaryote, or what we sometimes might refer to as eukaryotic cells. There's a T here. My T's are a little bit funny, aren't they? A eukaryotic cell. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, first of all, we need to realize that there is another bunch of cells which we're going to look at in a completely different tutorial, and they're what we call the prokaryotes. And really, with those, we're talking about things like bacteria and archaea. But with our eukaryotic cells, our plant and our animal cells, we're looking at a particular group of characteristics. Characteristic number one is they are what we call membrane bound organelles, or they contain, I should say, membrane bound organelles, and more of that exact concept in just a moment. The second point I would make about these is they have a definable and identifiable nucleus, which is separated via a membrane from the cell body. So that's all well and good, and that's fine, James, and you're telling us these things. Okay, can we convince ourselves of this by drawing this in a very simplistic form? So let me just give myself a little bit of space here. The first thing I want to do here is I want to draw the outer area of what might loosely now be called a cell. Okay, so what have we got here? We have here a cell membrane. So that's, not too staggeringly shocking for us. We've got a nice simple structure. It's kind of like a sac or a bag. It's a separation of this cell unit from others. But we have here a cell membrane. I might even use the term cellular membrane. That would actually be correct if I spelled it correctly. Cellular membrane. Okay, so cell membrane or cellular membrane. Okay, obviously those are one and the same idea. Let me just put that in brackets there. So we have our cellular membrane, and somewhere in here we're going to have a kind of jumbled string-like kind of structure that vaguely looks something like that. Now, importantly, this is what we refer to as your DNA, much more of which in other tutorials. Today is just about giving you the big picture. But there within that cell is where we have the DNA. Now, at this point, we could be talking about either eukaryotic or prokaryotic cells. But what I'm about to do now is going to separate those two groups. The important thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to draw a membrane, somewhat badly, around that DNA. And of course, it's that membrane which we are going to refer to as the nucleus. So we are now clearly talking about plant and animal cells. Why? Because the nucleus is membrane bound. Okay, so we have we have a membrane around that nucleus which defines it effectively as a eukaryotic cell. Now, we also want to realize, and I don't know why I'm going to do this in sort of light blue because it's not realistically kind of sea colored, but around in this cell, and I'm kind of doing it blue because it's in that sense kind of fluid-like within the cell, we have what we refer to as the cytoplasm. And the cytoplasm is the gel-like structure, the liquid structure within the cell. Now within that, we have some freestanding, kind of like, as I'm going to at least depict them, little green dots. Okay, now they're purely for depiction purposes, you understand. And I want to introduce you to these green dots as ribosomes, much more of which in just a few moments time. So we have these ribosomes which are in our cell also. So we now have a structural set of characteristics regarding what we refer to as plant and animal cells or eukaryotic cells. Okay, now what of course we want to do is we want to have much more information about each of these concepts. Let's go through that a little bit at a time. For the cellular membrane, the main point I want to or the main descriptive point here is I want to refer to it as an outer perimeter. And as I said before, the real purpose of that membrane is to separate this cell into its individualized unit. Okay, so without it, of course, it would be merging with other cells to make some kind of larger structure. So that outer perimeter is absolutely essential. We also want to talk. About this cytoplasm. Now we've already referred to it. If I got the same blue here, I don't think I have. Let me change. We've already referred to it as the fluid within the cells. Let's make sure we've noted that down. And then one of the things I'd sort of mention to you as well is that we have kind of two types of it. We also have what we call the nucleoplasm within the nucleus. Okay, within the nucleus. So just be aware that even though I've not kind of sketched it inside the membrane of the nucleus here, we also have this nucleoplasm which exists inside that structure as well. Now the ribosomes are super fascinating. Okay, so these ribosomes, the main point we want to get across about these guys is that they are protein producing. Now later on, when we look at these processes in a little bit more detail, we are going to realize that they ultimately interact with other structures, not least the mRNA, which is released from the nucleus, which can ultimately communicate with the ribosomes and translate then into protein forms. But the main point for the big picture right now is that ribosomes, they are protein producing. That's super, super important. Sometimes we kind of call them like protein factories. It's a nice way to think about it. And of course, those proteins, which again, we're going to find out more about in the future, is that they have quite specific processes, structures, and designs. So therefore, these ribosomes are really, really important structures. And of course, perhaps that leaves us with where some of the most important aspects of this cell are. We have our nucleus. Okay, so first of all, let's remind ourselves that our nucleus is surrounded by membrane. Okay, so that's really important to us. We need to make sure that we can recognize that, we can illustrate that also. And over here, of course, let's just make a second point about this nucleus. It contains genetic information. Of course, we know that because we have that DNA concept in there. It contains genetic information in the form of DNA. Okay, in the form of DNA. Now, there are huge amounts and there's a huge quantity of additional detail which we're going to gradually get into. But the key takeaways from this particular session are that we are talking about animal and plant-based cells in a eukaryotic structure. That ultimately means they have membrane-bound organelles. Notice our nucleus as a great example of that. Okay, we could also be talking about other organelles in here in more detail, but we'll leave that for other sessions. Now, a couple of other things I will just mention before we finish. I do want to sort of clarify the idea of an organelle. Okay, an organelle. It's a nice term for you to learn at this point. It is what we call, as we've touched on already, a membrane-bound structure within the cell. Membrane-bound structure. Okay, so by definition, our plant and animal cells have these organelles because that's what defines them as plant and animal cells. Okay, so we need to understand that. We also need to understand, again, I think this is really, really important at this point that we grasp this, that all plant and animal cells have what we describe as a high level of specialization. Each cell has a specific role, and for that reason, the structure that the specific and exact structure which it has and occupies will sort of be modeled around that specialization, those processes that the cell has to ultimately conduct. And again, another point I would sort of say to you here is that we can have situations where we have unicellular eukaryotic structures. So sometimes these eukaryotic structures can be one single cell, but more frequently, and perhaps where we're more kind of used to them, is where we talk about multicellular structures. You and I, me recording this video, you taking notes about this video, we are multicellular eukaryotic structures, and our cells are made up in this particular way. And my last point, just to kind of leave you hopefully enthralled and intrigued, is it's really important to realize at this point that we have absolutely incredible complexity at a microscopic scale. Okay, so we are going to get in detail into the scale of these things. But one of the things I'd really encourage you to kind of feel and wonder about at this point is this thing that I've drawn over here is so diminutive and tiny that it's almost unimaginable. And within it, okay, I've just sort of made an ugly looking drawing, but within it, the complexity within that cell is absolutely magnificent. And that complexity varies from cell to cell to cell. So we really want to sort of feel that concept, because I think it's something that can kind of really form the intrigue behind these kinds of topics.